We'll get started. Good evening, everyone. My name is Laurie McGavin Bachman. I work in the Adult Programs Department here at the library. I'd like to welcome you to our program tonight, Intemperate Habits, LGBTQ History from a Connecticut Perspective. Stephen Barkas, the Executive Director of the Ridgefield Historical Society, will introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Susan Ferentinos. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Ridgefield Historical Society, I'd like to welcome you to Intemperate Habits, LGBTQ History from a Connecticut Perspective, a special presentation by Dr. Susan Ferentinos. I'd like to thank Ridgefield Connecticut Pride and the Ridgefield Library for partnering with us on this program and for providing this beautiful space for tonight's gathering. And thank you to Connecticut Humanities for the generous grant to the Ridgefield Historical Society, which made this evening possible. Ridgefield CT Pride celebrates Ridgefield's LGBTQIA+ community, educates, promotes awareness, understanding, and acceptance, and fosters a sense of belonging as well as provides support for both LGBTQIA+ individuals and their friends and family. You can learn more by visiting their website, ridgefieldctpride.com. The Ridgefield Historical Society is dedicated to preserving the entire history of Ridgefield, from the indigenous people who lived here 10,000 years ago up to the present day. We are committed to the principles of diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion, and we strive to preserve the stories of all of Ridgefield's residents, past and present. Our headquarters is in the 1714 Scott House on Sunset Lane, and I encourage you to join us on this journey of exploration and discovery by becoming a member or a volunteer of the Historical Society, and by getting involved in many of the exciting initiatives that we currently have underway, including the Battle of Ridgefield Archaeology Project, the Branchville Schoolhouse Restoration Project, the forensic analysis of the Revolutionary War skeletal remains found on Main Street, the Ridgefield Historic Resources Inventory, living history programs at the Peter Parley Schoolhouse, the Ridgefield History Club, the Ridgefield Holiday Historic House Tour in collaboration with Tiger Hollow, and many, many more programs. So for tonight, this marks the launch of our exciting new Ridgefield LGBTQIA+ oral history project, funded in part by a generous $25,000 grant to the Ridgefield Historical Society from Connecticut Humanities. Numbering over 200 interviews with Ridgefield residents, the Historical Society's oral history collection is expansive, spanning topics ranging from World War II to the COVID pandemic. In this new initiative, under the guidance of Dr. Susan Ferentinos, our project advisor, students from Ridgefield High School, many of who are in attendance here this evening, will be taught oral history best practices, and the students will be conducting the interviews with Ridgefield LGBTQIA+ residents. The interviews will be professionally transcribed and cataloged and made publicly accessible in the Ridgefield Historical Society's online archive and in the Connecticut Digital Archive based at the University of Connecticut. Dr. Ferentinos will also assist in the creation of a published book of the interviews at the end of the 2-year project. The goals of this project are to record, preserve, and share Ridgefield's LGBTQIA+ stories, which are underrepresented in the Ridgefield Historical Society's collection and in the historical record. Also, to foster intergenerational conversation and to increase civic pride and awareness here in Ridgefield. We're thrilled that 18 students from Ridgefield High School have signed up to participate in this project, and they are being led by the GSA Club Advisor, Julie Henderson, who is also in attendance this evening. And if you'd like to be considered for an interview, please sign up on the Ridgefield CT Pride website. So for tonight's presentation, our special guest is Dr. Susan Ferentinos. She is a public history researcher, writer, and consultant helping cultural organizations share untold stories about women and LGBTQ people. She will be assisting with the Ridgefield Oral History Project, as I mentioned, as project advisor, and has recently worked with the Palmer Warner House in East Haddam, Connecticut, and the Eleanor Roosevelt National Historic Site in Hyde Park, New York. She is the author of the award-winning book, Interpreting LGBTQ History at Museums and Historic Sites, and has contributed her expertise to the National Park Service initiative, Telling All American Stories. Please join me in welcoming Susan to Ridgefield.
Well, hello. Thank you, everyone. I am super excited to be here. Stephen just got me very excited all over again about this project. It is a special pleasure to get to be involved with projects that foster, as Stephen was saying, intergenerational understanding. So much has changed in the world of LGBTQ communities within the lifetime of our elders, and I love the idea of people from different generations coming together to learn from each other. So I'm delighted to be a part of it. Now, I am a historian, it is true. This is what brings me here tonight. And within the big profession of history, I am what is known as a social historian. And generally, social historians are interested in the big historical trends of the past. And in fact, the whole reason that area of history exists is, it's been around for quite a while, since about the mid-20th century, but it emerged as an effort to get rid of what, I'm not sure if we still call it this, but what has traditionally been called the Great White Man's history. That the idea that only certain powerful, wealthy, usually male, usually white, people made a difference in U.S. history, and those are the people that can teach us about the past. But regular people, laborers, under-resourced people, people that have been traditionally excluded from sites of power. The idea behind social history is that those histories are also important. And there's a little bit of a tension, I have realized, in the course of preparing this talk, because while social historians very much like to think about the collective, how groups of people impacted history, often the documents or the evidence of these less powerful people in the past are harder to come by. Their stories and their letters haven't been preserved. And oral history helps us with that. And that's where the tension is. We're asking questions about communities and about collective change, but yet we often turn to individual stories through oral history to try to access that. So there's a tension between individual experiences and these larger historical trends. And so in honor of this tension, this evening, I'm going to offer a selection of historical individuals who have had an impact on U.S. LGBTQ history. All of these individuals selected for you tonight have connections to Connecticut. And I'll be discussing these individual experiences while also talking about why these individuals had an impact on larger historical trends. So we shall begin in the 17th century with the case of Nicholas Sension, who was tried for sodomy in 1677 in the Connecticut colony. And for those in the room who are maybe less versed in the nuances of the word sodomy, since it's not in such common usage now as it once was. Sodomy actually is not a super clearly defined term, particularly if we're talking about 20th century sodomy laws versus 17th century sodomy laws. But often when we're talking about sodomy and whether or not it's legal, we are talking about sex between men, specifically men. And, but in other historical circumstances, sodomy has been used broadly to mean any type of sexual interaction that doesn't result in a pregnancy or doesn't have a chance of resulting in a pregnancy. So that would include masturbation, oral sex between anybody, men, women. And, but in the case of Nicholas Sension, he was actually tried for sex with other men. And this court case is important to historians' understanding of same-sex desire and behavior in the British or in the English colonies in North America, because of all, and there's not many of them, I assure you, but of all the evidence we have of sodomy trials in the colonial period, Nicholas Sension's court case has the most detailed testimony. So historians use this case to extrapolate about a lot of things, a lot of assumptions and aspects of day-to-day life, particularly in the New England colonies. So as a little context, in the Connecticut colony, sodomy was a capital crime. So that meant you could be put to death if found guilty of sodomy. If you were a man found guilty of having sex with another man. That was true beginning in 1642, when the colony adopted a list of 12 crimes that were punishable by death. And they specifically said man lying with man was what the crime was. That law was amended in 1672, so just a few years before this trial, to exempt from death for sodomy any person who had been forced to engage in sodomy or who was under the age of 15. Just as an aside, there was also a New Haven colony during part of the colonial period, and New Haven colony was the only English colony in North America that did include sex between women as a capital crime as well. That law was passed in 1656, but by the time of this trial of Nicholas Sension, New Haven colony had been absorbed into Connecticut colony. Nicholas Sension, by the way, lived in Windsor, Connecticut. But despite this rather shocking, extreme punishment for same-sex sexual behavior between men, in reality, not many people were accused and brought to trial for this, what was then a crime. And this is in contrast to what was going on in Europe, where a lot of people were being tried, and a fair number of them were being put to death for sodomy. So this has led historians to kind of generalize and conclude that, life was rough in the colonies, right? I mean, we think of like the Western frontier, like think of that times 10 in the 17th century across the ocean from, from the colonial power. And so historians have generally said, so these laws were adopted because they were the laws in Europe, particularly in England, but, colonists were concerned with survival. They weren't necessarily, looking for, to not work together in community. And so that it was more a formality than like an actual lived experience. So again, this court case is interesting because this is an exception to that generalization that historians have made. And it's also interesting because Nicholas Senchen was, in colonial terms, which as I said, life was rough in the colonies, but he was a man of some wealth. He was also married to a woman, and he was, at the time of his trial, he was older. He was in his 50s or 60s. And generally, in New England colonies, people that are tried with a number of crimes related to social disorder, historians have identified a larger historical trend that they tend to be young, single people. So one exception to that is witchcraft. It's either young, unattached women or older, widowed women who were tried. In the sodomy cases, they tend to be unattached young men. And the thinking behind this is that these were people who were likely to cause social disharmony and discord within a colonial community. And so their behavior was policed more heavily. Some might say adolescent behavior is still policed quite heavily even in our own time. But nevertheless, despite these advantages that Nicholas Senchen had, he was brought to trial, and the testimony, because as you know, we have more testimony, like more detailed testimony about this case than any other, revealed that he was quite, if you'll forgive me, he was quite the sodomite. He had a 30-year history of propositioning men for sex within the Windsor community. And now, keep in mind, under the law that was in play at this time, if another man had had sex with Nicholas Senchen, that man would also be subject to trial and risk being put to death. So you always have to pay attention to your sources, right? Because nobody was admitting if you took this testimony at face value, poor Nicholas Senchen was trying to find a sexual partner for over 30 years in the village of Windsor and never once succeeded. But, who would stand before a colonial court and say, yes, I too have committed a capital crime? So, because of the lack of evidence of Senchen ever having actually succeeded at having sex with another man, he was ultimately found guilty of attempted sodomy. So not a capital crime, thank goodness. But his punishment was still pretty severe. His entire estate, so basically all his wealth, all his land, his money, his livestock, were put in bond for good behavior. So, so the community held his wealth until his death. So his wife could inherit it, but Nicholas Senchen himself had to go through the town in order to access his own wealth. So there's a lot of interesting things about here. I don't have time to I could teach a whole course on this one court case, but what we do know from this court case is that for 30 years, Nicholas Senchen was propositioning the men of Windsor, and nobody bothered to report it or have him arrested or tried until someone did, and then they were all called as witnesses. But that in and of itself is interesting. It kind of adds to this conclusion historians have made that people kind of turned a blind eye. It was a fact of life in colonial New England as it is all over in all time periods. And, it wasn't quite the cause for moral panic that it maybe would be in other time periods. Flying ahead 200 years to, I realize, I apologize, this is a typo. This is actually supposed to say the 1860s. Nevertheless, about 200 years later, we have another example of same-sex love and desire from Connecticut that has also had a big impact on the larger understanding of LGBTQ experiences in the United States. And this is the romantic friendship between Rebecca Primus and Addie Brown. And Primus and Brown they were both free African-American women who lived in Connecticut. Primus was born to a middle-class family, and she was trained as a teacher in Hartford. Addie Brown was, her level of literacy, we know from the letters between them, was much lower. She was literate, but just barely so. So less educated. She worked as a domestic servant in households around Connecticut, mostly, in a 19th century traveling distance to Hartford as well. We have their letters because immediately after the Civil War, Rebecca Primus traveled to the South to teach in a recently opened school to teach the African Americans who had been freed by the Civil War. And so the bulk of the letters stem from the few years when these two were apart. And I should say that picture is not of these two women. It's hard to find historical pictures, so we have no pictures of the two women. But their letters reveal a devotion to each other, as well as a certain level of physical intimacy and certainly romantic love. As one example, a letter from Addie Brown tells Rebecca, "You are the first girl that I ever loved so, and you are the last one. Dear Rebecca, do not say anything against me loving you so, for I mean just what I say. Oh, Rebecca, it seems I can see you now, casting those loving eyes at me. If you were a man, what would things come to? They would come to something very quick." And later letters reference, as I said, physical intimacy. Like, you know, they're not charting the course of every touch and caress, but it is clear that they have had nights of intimacy together to some extent. Addie also, on multiple occasions, signed her letter Addie Brown Primus. So adopting Rebecca Primus's last name, as women at that time did when they got married to men. And this, as some of you may well know, intense loving and romantic relationships between women were, to our eyes in the 21st century, surprisingly common in the 19th century. But they were surprisingly common among white, educated, middle-class women, generally speaking. So this collection of letters is a real treasure for historians because it offers a glimpse into these romantic relationships between two African-American women and also two women who were of differing classes. Like, we don't know how they met each other originally, given that they kind of resided in different social worlds. Another Connecticut resident who has had a big impact on LGBTQ history is Anthony Comstock. I realized I forgot to ask Stephen before my talk how you pronounce the town that looks like it is pronounced New Canaan? Is that how you say it? Close by. Anthony Comstock was born and raised in that town, and he went on. He left Connecticut to join the Union Army for the Civil War when he was 19. And then after that, he resided in New York, and he was mostly active in New York. At some point, he moves over to New Jersey, but that's still sort of his base of operation, New York metro area. But he had, so he is best known as a social purity crusader, which was a whole movement in the late 19th and early 20th century among people who really felt like the morals of the country were in swift decline. So Anthony Comstock is best known for enacting he wasn't a lawmaker, but he was let's say a lobbyist or an activist. And he, thanks to his advocacy, a series of laws were passed that were known forevermore as the Comstock laws. There was a brief flurry in like the last year or maybe 18 months about editorials talking about the return of the Comstock laws, and this is the guy who put those laws into place. And the Comstock laws, passed in 1873, had a huge impact on U.S. LGBTQ history, and not a positive one, I will say. But these laws prohibited any obscene behavior from traveling through the U.S. mail. The definition of what was obscene was pretty strict, and it meant that pretty much any information about sexuality, like, you say sexuality, Comstock says obscene can't go through the mail. So this meant a lot of things, and Comstock laws were on the books for about 80 years. So, for instance, those of you who know a bit about LGBTQ history know that in Europe, scientists and doctors began talking about the preference of certain people for romantic and sexual expression with members of their same sex. And they began talking about these things in medical literature in the 1860s. That happens much later in the United States. And many doctors who were interested in studying this topic had to go to Europe to learn about it because medical literature in the United States couldn't discuss sexual topics. Or even if they would have passed the censor's review, medical journals didn't want the bad publicity to risk being censored, so they were much more conservative at the turn of the century in talking about sexual realities of all kinds. Venereal disease, for instance, problems with pregnancy, but certainly people who are identifying as a gender different than what society thinks their gender identification should be, or people who are desiring members of their same sex. So just information sharing is greatly restricted in the United States. Also, as we get a little further along, you could say it started in the 1890s, but certainly by the 1920s, there are LGBTQ subcultures just slowly beginning in big cities in the United States. But they're very suppressed, and the different communities can't really communicate with each other because there can't be an LGBTQ magazine, for instance, because it can't be sent through the U.S. mail. So this goes on, as I said, for 80 years until the 1950s, and it is other parts of other people relevant to LGBTQ history who ultimately get these laws overturned. A series of court cases in the 1950s overturn these laws. One is brought by One Magazine, which was just about the first LGBTQ magazine. But, there were some surreptitious ones going around, but One wanted to be the national gay magazine and kept getting censored by the U.S. Postmaster, so eventually went to court. And the other one was Dr. Alfred Kinsey, who was an early sexologist. He studied people's sexual behavior, and he published the Kinsey Reports, if you've ever heard of that, in the right around 1950, and told Americans what Americans were actually doing, not what the preachers said they should be doing. And he was also fighting with the Postmaster because he was trying to study sexuality, and so was having a lot of things mailed to him, either from Europe, from other people he was asking about their sexual experiences or their sexual studies, because he was a scientist. And he was also just trying to learn about different sexual subcultures in the US. So he was asking people about them, and they were writing him back. So he went to court. Actually, I think the Postmaster took him to court, but the decision was brought in favor of that. And so slowly these laws eroded. And moving into the 20th century, we have Dr. Alan Hart, who is generally, if you hear about him, you hear about him within the context of Oregon, because a lot of things, he was from Oregon, and he was educated as a doctor in Oregon. He spent his early life in Oregon, but he spent his later life in Connecticut. And he is one of the first people in the United States, and again, this was happening in the United States later than it was happening in Europe, but he is one of the first people to receive gender-affirming medical treatment, surgery specifically, in the United States. he had a hysterectomy in 1917, specifically because he convinced a doctor that he was a man and that to become pregnant would be psychologically devastating to him. And so that all took place in Oregon. Interestingly, he was recognized, he was trained as a doctor, and so he was recognized by a fellow student while receiving this gender-affirming surgery. So he was outed, and so there exists a not entirely unsympathetic interview with him in like his hometown newspaper in 1918. They're just like asking him, like, tell us about your experience. Do you know? So you think you're a man, but we knew you as a woman. And it's, again, I mean, being a historian is fascinating because, you know, the past always surprises you, right? You think you know what a small town in Oregon's reaction would be to someone they know deciding to live as an identity that that town did not recognize when he lived there. But that didn't happen. Nevertheless, Dr. Hart did have a very hard time actually practicing medicine, although he did have his medical degree, because his degree was issued under the female name that he was given at birth. And so he couldn't prove that he was a doctor to a potential employer without outing himself as transgender. But he used his medical degree in research, and he actually is significant to all of U.S. history because he was an early pioneer in using x-rays to identify tuberculosis, which, you know, in the early 20th century is a raging disease. Like, lots of people die from tuberculosis. And at that time, before Dr. Hart, people weren't diagnosed with TB until they were at an advanced stage. So all the time between getting TB and being diagnosed, they were spreading it to other people. And the use of x-rays allowed doctors to diagnose people much earlier. And that is a big part of the reason TB, I mean, it still exists, but it's nowhere near as prevalent as it was in the late 19th and early 20th century, in large part because of Alan Hart's research. And that was actually recognized by the state of Connecticut, who in 1948 hired him to serve on the state tuberculosis commission. And so he and his wife, because he was actually married twice, one marriage ended in divorce, but his second marriage lasted until he died of old age. And he and his wife moved to Hartford in the late 40s, where they stayed until his death in the early 60s. Then we have the famous Supreme Court decision, Griswold versus Connecticut, which was issued in 1965 and is the Supreme Court case that its shorthand is it's a Supreme Court case that legalized birth control. It's actually the Supreme Court case that legalized married couples to get birth control. Unmarried people, particularly unmarried women, still had a very difficult time obtaining. It was a state-by-state basis whether it was legal for unmarried women to access birth control. And now you may be saying, if there is one thing that seems not relevant to LGBTQ history, It might be birth control and access to birth control. But I am going to make a different argument about this. By the way, the woman on the left is Estelle Griswold. She was the executive director of New Haven Planned Parenthood. I forget the name of the other woman in the picture, but she was also part of like the Planned Pregnancy League in New Haven or another pro-birth control organization. And they are giving the victory sign after the ruling that legalized, to some extent, birth control. This was important to LGBTQ history for two reasons. And one is that it is the first Supreme Court decision in U.S. history that recognized sexual privacy as a right. So it took a long time for that concept to get to Supreme Court cases dealing with sex between members of the same sex, homosexual sex. But it eventually got there, and this was a start of that precedent within legal history. It was also, incidentally, the idea that sexual privacy was a right was a tenet in Roe versus Wade, legalizing abortion, which happened about 7 years later. This again was 1965. The other reason I would argue that this is relevant to LGBTQ history is that as married, presumably heterosexual, although, that's a broad stroke. That's not necessarily true. But married women getting control, to some extent, over the number of children that they have through legal birth control made them more independent. And as women writ large gained independence, they became aware of roadblocks to their independence that existed because of the assumption that they weren't in the workforce, for instance, or that they didn't need to have their own lines of credit because they were staying at home raising kids and their husbands were the public face of the family. So that made married women with increasing independence more empathetic and more aware and more in need of the same legal protections that unmarried women, many of whom were unmarried because they were partnered with other women, married women began fighting for similar protections and rights that benefited women that chose not to be married to men. And so it created a critical mass of activism that gave honestly, just a better life to lesbian couples because they were able to earn higher wages. They were protected from job discrimination. They were able to access lines of credit, things like that. A similar argument I will make in the next slide in just a moment, which is now bringing it home to Ridgefield. Here we have just a couple examples of people that have influenced LGBTQ history. In Ridgefield itself, Alice Paul is a famous suffragist. She is the author of the Equal Rights Amendment, written in the 1920s. And she, I would say the evidence is not particularly strong that she would identify as a lesbian. She never married. She was very critical of heterosexual marriage. She did have a special female friend, but they never lived together. They often spent a year apart. So I think she was a woman obsessed with a cause, which was feminism. And any questions of her sexual identity were sort of on the back burner. But regardless, the same thing, suffrage, the right to vote, getting a political voice, had a huge impact on women across the board, but particularly lesbians, women that never had some man incorporating their political desires in their vote, which was one of the arguments about why women didn't need the vote. Maury Sendak, author of Where the Wild Things Are, was announced late, like in the last 5 years of his life, publicly announced that he was gay. And he had in fact had a partner for over 50 years who had had recently died when he made that announcement. Harvey Fierstein is an author and a playwright, and I don't know. Can you see me being all aflutter? I love Harvey Fierstein. So he has, in addition to simply being a famous actor and playwright, he has done a great deal of work in bringing the experiences of gay men, portraying them in his art to a wider audience. And I would say also the experiences of Jewish people. And you could make a similar argument about Maury Sendak with his books. So, so at least two of the three people on this slide have an interesting tension about sharing outsider experiences from a variety of perspectives, which I think is particularly interesting. So, in conclusion, I will simply give some credit. You know, a lot of public talks don't come from original research. They come from reading other people's research. And in this case, I definitely checked out the Connecticut Historical Society's 2019 exhibit on Connecticut LGBTQ history. And I encourage you to do the same if you haven't yet. If you say LGBTQ Connecticut Historical Society, you will find it. It's now an online exhibit. And with that, I'll open it up for questions and comments from you. What you got for me? Yes.
So, in the time when the mail was being censored, was all the mail that people were sending just being opened?
No. Good question. So, there was sneakiness, happening for sure. So, in fact, the general ruling is by historians is that the first thing we can call an LGBTQ publication in the United States was like a mimeographed news, which is like a precursor to a copier. Mimeographed newsletter that was sent out from LA in the 40s. But that's like, she would type up like 25 versions of the newsletter and send to her friends, and then they would send it was a lesbian paper, they would send it to their friends. But that was just like one private individual to another private individual, so like that was below the censor's radar. It was more things like a medical journal that's sending out thousands of copies of their publication. So it was more like publications, and it was also like the pornography, like pornographic magazines were very like, kind of like sold in back alleys kind of thing, because you couldn't just like subscribe to a pornographic magazine because it would have to go through the mail. So, but yeah, they weren't opening, it wasn't that level of censorship. Other questions? Yes?
So did they have any record of anybody being executed for this sodomy in the colonies. I know, it was tried and it was on the books. I mean, there's lots of things in the Bible about, you die if you do this and do that, but it never happens. So I don't know.
As I said, there are lots of examples of that in Europe. There, I believe, are no examples of that in Connecticut. I think there was like one person executed in New Amsterdam colony and maybe two in Massachusetts colony or something. I at one point knew the answer to that. I'm kind of digging deep
So there
for
were
that.
more witches burned than...
Yeah. So the specifics of what I say, you can fact check me on it, and they may or may not be true, but the spirit of it, not no one, and anyone who died for that reason, it was an atrocity, and they deserve to be remembered. But it wasn't a widespread thing here. Yes?
And you ascribe that to the colonists needing to get along and not their sort of overriding puritanical desire to quash this behavior?
It is an interesting thing. Yes, that is one of the theories, particularly about the New England colonies, because they were the most religiously conservative. Another explanation is that the colonists that came to the New England colonies, tended to migrate in family groups. So it's sort of self-selecting people who have chosen to be married. That's not to say that there's a hard line between people who desire sex with their own sex and people who get heterosexually married, but there's a certain tending towards people who are arriving in nuclear families. The Chesapeake colonies, in contrast, are full of men who are trying to get wealthy and then either get to live as part of the elite in a new place that would be harder for them in England, or to get wealthy and then return to England at a different class. So the Chesapeake colonies, Virginia and Maryland, have a really big gender imbalance. There's it varies over the course of the colonial period, but at one point it's one woman to every 20 men. And there's a lot of evidence that those guys were all sleeping together. Regardless of how in the 20th century they might say identify their sexual identity, in a circumstance with a lot of men, a lot of young single men, and not a lot of women, there was still a lot of sex going on. So that is another theory, is that that in the Chesapeake colonies, people were turning a blind eye, because otherwise all they'd be doing is bringing people to trial. But in New England, that it was also just more family-oriented. There were more women present, and it between survival and not disrupting society by, say, bringing a married man to a sodomy trial, which is what happened in the case of Senchen. That it was just, that they too, but for different reasons, tended to turn a blind eye. Yeah.
LGBTQ oral history projects, do you find that they're happening more in other places, and is there a history of these type of projects?
Yes, and I will just like to state the obvious that the Ridgefield Oral History Project will get completely different aspects of LGBTQ history than were presented here this evening, I kind of intentionally saved the lived experience of many of the elders in this community out of this. You know, the gay liberation movement, experience with AIDS, the don't ask, don't tell, fight for legal marriage, because there will be another public event in a couple of years at the end of this project, and we'll be talking about what we find out from the Ridgefield elders. So stay tuned for that. But as far as LGBTQ history in general, oral history was a super powerful tool for fiery, young, gay liberationists in the 1970s who tended to be baby boomers who, not all gay liberationists were historically minded, but those who were put that fervor towards capturing, recovering the queer past that was in danger of being lost. We'll talk more about that with the oral history interviewers during our workshop tomorrow. But that's when LGBTQ oral history really got its start. And I'm talking the 70s, early 80s. And those are wonderful things, because what they were doing were talking to their elders who had come out in World War I, or who had been in the speakeasies of Prohibition in the 1920s, finding the gay social scene. And so that's kind of the background of LGBT oral history. And now, same thing, we found things about World War II, being gay, within the military in World War II, primarily through oral histories. So we learn a little bit more about each generation through people in their older age talking about it when it becomes more socially acceptable, which has been kind of the trend in the last 100 years. It hasn't always been the trend. But we know a lot about people who came out within the context of the 1960s and 70s and further on. We do already know a lot about them, and I think the power of oral history is to actually, it's a process whereby the people who are being interviewed end up, are given the opportunity to think about their life holistically and think about their life in relation to these larger historical trends. And I think that's a really powerful process just for the individual. But to see that happening on a large scale reveals something new about the past and a particular generation. And then also, these days, a lot of oral history projects like this one are bringing in younger members of LGBTQ communities to hear about the experiences of older members of these communities, to some extent, vice versa, to hear about the reality of coming out at different moments in U.S. history. And so there's still a lot of power in oral history projects, but the specifics of that impact have changed a little over time.
Thank you.
I was hearing announcements. Does this mean we got to shut down the show? What's going on? Okay.
I want to thank you for the presentation and remind everybody that this is our Transgender Awareness Week. So it's nice that you're here. And I've read a number of histories, and I'm fascinated by the number of women who entered the Revolutionary War to fight on behalf of the colonists by changing their gender or presenting as males. And then that continued on in future wars, too. I'm sure it was happening in the past, too. But it was nice that was documented.
Yes, that very much. I didn't select any of those examples, but it's true. From as at least in the U.S., as far back as the U.S. Revolution, there are examples of people who in their home communities had been raised as women opting to cross genders and fight in the revolution, living as men. And that is neat. It is a very interesting aspect of history, and it continues in all the wars, Civil War as well. Other questions, comments? Oh, yes. I'm sorry, I got a spotlight. I didn't see you back there.
Just go back to Nicholas for a second. I know that like during the Salem witch trials, a lot of it, or all of it, had to do with money and land and taking it. And it feels like Nicholas's case for 30 years, this open secret, it feels like they just wanted his money.
Interesting point. I hadn't actually thought of that, but that you're right about the Salem witch trials, and that does there's a resonance there, right? That this feels a little similar to that. There was another kind of specific part of the trial where one of his servants, who the trial calls him a servant, but he had been with the family since he was a young boy, which makes it sound more like he was an apprentice. But he had gone at one point to another, to a neighbor, to talk about the Senshin and his advances, and so then the neighbor went to Senshin. Senshin said, well, he can be released from his obligations to me if he wants to. And the young man who worked for Senshin chose to stay. So, of course, as I said, you're not admitting to sodomy in the 17th century in Connecticut. So that may have been a factor, but the neighbor understood that to mean because Senshin didn't have any biological children, that the servant may have been hoping to inherit something from Senshin as well. So again, it does seem like there was a lot of interest in his wealth, even though another generalization about this time is that it's the unpowerful people in society which is, oh my goodness, it's the same in the 1970s and the 1940s. It's like the people who reside in a most precarious position in society tend to run into the most legal trouble for a variety of reasons.
Just to follow up on that point, is there any evidence in the record of that trial that Senshin owned slaves or a slave?
My understanding is that he did not own slaves. He was using indentured servants and he himself had emigrated from England in 1640. So he'd already, for almost as long as he'd been propositioning the men of Windsor, he had been in the colonies, but he had been raised in England, and I think that my impression was that the majority of any talk of servants was apprentices, indentured servants, people that were under contract to him, but would ultimately be free to leave his service. All right. I really want to thank you. This is a lovely turnout, and up until a month or so ago, my knowledge of Connecticut LGBTQ history was not what it is this evening, and so I have really appreciated the opportunity to learn more about this little corner of New England, and particularly about the impact Ridgefield itself has had on LGBTQ history. And I'm looking forward to finding out more over the course of this oral history project. So thank you.